And is everyone seeing my screen right now?
Yes.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
And you're seeing my full screen and not the presenter screen, correct?
Being the cover page of a
Perfect.
slideshow.
Board governance?
Yep.
Yep.
Perfect. 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 Okay. So again, it's 4:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. You are currently attending board governance, governing in a crisis. And to let you know that we are going to begin recording this session right now. And why am I not? There we go. If for some reason you can't get the audio through your computer, you might want to go ahead and dial in via your phone. We're going to mute all of you from our side so that we have the best audio possible. And if you have questions, please type them in the chat feature. We will be saving time the last 30 minutes. We'll save for questions and answers. So that way we'll do the presentation in the hour. And then for those of you who want to stay for Q&A, absolutely invite you to do that. Okay, so actually before we get started, let me just start off with who we are and why we are here. I'm Liz Vibber with the Catalyst Center for Nonprofit Management, which is affiliated with B. Bergvall & Company, CPA firm. My colleague and co-presenter Cindy Bergvall is also with us today. And this mini board boot camp session is in lieu of the full 3-hour board boot camp training we had scheduled. We actually had 2 of them scheduled back at the beginning of April and end of April before the world kind of tipped. So once we all kind of got our footing again, we decided to do a mini session for you specifically around the governance component of that full board boot camp, focusing on governing in a crisis. So that brings us to where we are right now. There are about, I'm going to say just shy of 30 participants registered for the session, and we will make it available to you on our website afterward. So to get started, we really want to talk about board responsibilities and just making sure that you are all clear that the board is responsible. You're the legal guardian of the organization, and you're responsible for the organization's welfare. So this is done through your power of governance. And so today we'll spend time really talking about that. So when we talk about the basics of governance, we often talk about the duties and responsibilities. And there are 3 main duties that we focus on: duty of loyalty, duty of care, and duty of obedience. And we won't dig too deep into them today, but just so you know, duty of loyalty is really being true to the organization, being true to the organization's mission, avoiding conflict of interest from a governance perspective. This is where your conflict of interest form that you sign every year comes into play. Duty of care, really being prudent and carefully making decisions. And certainly now when we're governing in a crisis, this is more important than ever because we want to make sure that we're really thinking about the organization. And then we have duty of obedience. And duty of obedience is really staying true to the organization, staying true to the organization's bylaws, mission, and vision and values. So we want to really focus on that for our duty of obedience. And then we have our responsibilities. And there are 10 basic responsibilities, and you'll see them all here. We won't go into all of them. But for this presentation, really understanding number 3, number 4, and number 7. So when we're in crisis mode, we really want to make sure that we are supporting the chief executive, not so much evaluating, but really supporting and making sure that we know what they are facing and focused on in the organization. And then there's effective planning. So when we're in a crisis, we want to make sure that we are effectively planning, that we're doing and making moves and adjusting the levers, if you will, in a way that makes sense for the organization. And then certainly during this time, number 7, protecting the financial assets of the organization, providing financial oversight. This really has come into play for a lot of organizations at this time. So when we begin to really look at all of these things, we do best practices. And the best practices that we really look at and utilize, whoops, yes, we're muting everyone. We utilize BoardSource and the Pennsylvania Association of
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't think the slides are advancing on our end.
Okay. How about now? Are we seeing best practices? Yes, okay. Thank you, thank you. I muted and then it stopped my share. So best practices. The sources that we utilize most of the time for our best practices are BoardSource, PANO, which is the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations, and the National Council of Nonprofits. There are a number of great organizations out there, and we draw from a number of them for the information that we provide to you. So when we go into Code Red, or really go into this crisis situation, generally in a strong organization, the board chair and the executive director are having regular communication already. So in a lot of organizations, you're talking on a weekly basis. At the very minimum, you're talking before the board meeting on a monthly basis. So that relationship should already have been established prior to any crisis. And so once the board chair and the executive director are really able to get a handle on what's happening, then we might broaden to include the executive committee. It's not always easy or practical to convey the whole board immediately. So we start with the smaller executive committee, again, so that we can get a handle on what's going on. And then once the executive committee has handled the situation and beginnings of a path forward, then we can loop in the full board. And once we have the full board in place and we begin planning and activating any type of plan that we're going to be focused on, then we might create a crisis team. And that crisis team could be a full committee that's taking on some of the responsibilities, or it could be a task group. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. So we have a committee structure in our organizations. So we have standing committees, and then we have task groups or ad hoc committees, they're sometimes called. So the difference is that our standing committees at a minimum should be your finance committee, your executive committee, and your governance committee. Those are the 3 that are best practice that you have. And then you have other standing committees that are prudent for your organization. So many organizations have a development committee, for example, or perhaps a personnel committee. And what defines a committee is that they have a job description, that they meet regularly, and that they have ongoing work. Now, in this instance of a crisis, your active committees might pivot to meet the need that's happening. And so an example of that might be your finance committee. So your finance committee might pivot some of its regular standing work to focus in on crisis work. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The other type of support that your board should have is your task group structure. And task groups are a little bit different because they are formed as needed. So they generally have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The work that they do is defined initially, and then when that work is completed, that task group might disband. Now, you might find that creating a crisis team that I mentioned on the previous slide is actually a task group for your organization, because it might have very specific work, and once we're past the immediate crisis, that task group is no longer necessary. This is also a time for you to really think about board expectations. So a stronghold of best practice and good governance is having board expectations. And some of the things that are included in expectations include terms. So do we have board terms? Do we not have board terms? And limits. So some organizations might have a 3-year limit, a 6-year limit, or a 9-year limit, depending. So the way that would actually work is 1 term would be 3 years, and then 3 terms would be 9 years. Oftentimes, once an organization reaches the end of the term, board members will rotate off. Now, there are organizations that don't have term limits, and board members don't rotate off, and they stay on for the long haul. And there are pros and cons to both of those structures, and you really want to think about what's best for your organization and your organizational culture. And then we have attendance. So what is the protocol for absences? What is the expectation for attending board meetings? If you meet every month, you might have 11 board meetings a year. Oftentimes boards take off either in August or December, depending. And what's the protocol if board members miss meetings? If they miss 2 or 3 meetings without having had a conversation with governance or the board chair, then you want to be clear on what happens. Are you still considered a member of the board or not? Sometimes your expectations might be 3 missed board meetings in a row is equal to a resignation, and that you might off-board that individual. Time commitment. So we'll talk about what the time commitment is for the organization serving on the board. 10 hours a month, 5 hours a month, 20 hours a month. It really depends on your organization, but it's very helpful during recruitment if you're clear on what that is, so that we can talk to board members about what that expectation is in terms of time. And that would include time on committees and task groups, which brings us to the next piece. And I've highlighted it in red because, again, it's critical for us during this time of crisis. We want to activate our committee structure. So we want to make sure that board members, when they join the organization, understand what their obligation is to serve on a committee, so that we can activate them during this time. And then the other areas under expectation might include financial contribution to the organization. You might have a give and or a get policy, participation in fundraising activities, organizational activities, and then certainly to enhance the organization's public standing. So we want to really make sure that we're all talking about the boards that we serve on and sharing the mission of that work. And certainly during this time when many of us are looking for additional sources of revenue, being clear and vocal about the organizations that we serve on and the needs of the organization is going to come into play here, as it might drive donor dollars or reveal potential grants for our organization during this time.
Liz, can I interrupt with a question?
Absolutely.
We have a question about, is it possible to have a mix of termed members of the board and non-termed members of the board if it is clarified in the Constitution and bylaws?
I would say yes, because you really are going to define that in your bylaws. So when you onboard those individuals, you want to make sure that that's very clear. And during your board orientation, you also want to make sure that it's clear to all the board members that there are different obligations of board members. Some are termed and some are not. Does anyone have that structure? Okay,
You can't see me, Liz. It's Bonnie Bates, and we in fact do.
okay,
We have great difficulty finding secretaries for our board, and so our secretary has no term.
okay,
She can serve as long, she or he can serve as long as they would like as the secretary. That is clarified in our bylaws.
okay,
Everyone else has a 3-year term.
okay. And is that because of the onus of taking minutes for the organization?
It's minutes, it's time, it's folks who can't be engaged in board conversations and take minutes at the same time.
Okay,
And we've toyed with recording. That makes some people uncomfortable.
okay. And do you have staff in your organization?
Yes, and I have a staff member who takes notes with the secretary so they compare them.
Okay. Okay, and Bonnie, that's something that we can revisit and talk a little bit in more detail if you'd like offline about some options for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So what I want to do at this point, since what I have highlighted in red here is committee work, I want to pass the screen over to Cindy and talk a little bit about what it might look like for your organization to activate the finance committee, for example.
Good, thank you, Liz. While we're making that switch, I wanted to ask by a show of thumbs. So thumbs up is that your organization is fully operational. Thumbs down is not operational at all. And you know, you can kind of go like this as far as partial. So let's see where we are. I see a down, I see ups, I see tilts in between. So it looks like we have a little bit of everything, probably 2 downs. Thank you very much. That's really helpful for me to know going into this presentation.
Cindy, I'll move the slides for you.
Oh, thank you. That will be great. So one of the first things that you're going to run into is how much cash do we have? Because even if you're fully operational, you might find yourself in a situation where you're very concerned about your donations, revenue sources, foundations, program revenues. Even if you're fully operational, are you able to bill the way you normally did? Do you know, if you're a private school and you have tuition, you might be fully operational, but if you have parents on unemployment, they might not be able to pay their tuition as timely as they used to be able to. So you're going to want to prepare a cash flow projection. How detailed this is will depend on the type of your organization. But this is a really good example about how you're going to engage your finance committee. Depending on the size of your organization, this might be something that your accounting department would take on and then coordinate with your finance committee or brainstorm through this with your finance committee. Or if you're a very small organization, it could be your board treasurer working with your executive director. If you're completely volunteer, this could be your treasurer working with your chair. So this is a very basic example. It shows your actual cash at the beginning of April. In this example, it's $80,000. You know, for April, you got 62,000, you use 68, so you're ending 74. Then you're going to project what you think might happen for May, June, and July. And shortly, we'll talk about how you can project revenues and expenses. You can list your revenues in more detail under here, but this shows you what the summarized version looks like. And this just goes through. So your cash ending balance for April becomes your beginning balance for May, ending balance for May becomes the beginning balance for June, and so on. You can do this in more detail. So you might say first week in May, second week in May, third week in May. Depending on how much cash you have will depend on how detailed this will get. And as you can see in our example here, you're starting April with $80,000. In 4 months, by the end of July, you only have $44,000. And when we look at this situation, you think, well, revenues aren't really projected to go down that much. Expenses only went up slightly. But when all is said and done, we have a $10,000 gap these 3 months between revenues and expenses. So April, big hit. Even though it doesn't get worse and worse as time goes on, just the fact that every month you're eating into your reserves, you really need to do this. And if you haven't done it already, you'll want to do it soon, because you want to see, this is what is commonly called your burn rate. So you want to see your burn rate. If things keep going the way they are, how many months can we continue to operate, and what does that look like? Because as you can see, if this organization was to keep going, they're going to get through August, September, October, and November, and then sometime in December, they're going to have $4,000 left, and that's not a sustainable organization. So they're clearly going to need to take steps on these expenses. So that's on our next slide. We go into this in a little more depth. So you can see this next slide, we're going to take our revenues and we're going to say, how can we project out our revenues and what might they look like? So on our first example, the numbers in this slide do not necessarily correspond to the previous slide. But for your organization, you would want to say, normally, for a normal month, we would expect our revenues to be $35,000. If we only get 80% of our revenues in these different areas, it would come down to $28,400. If we got 50%, this would be, let's say, your worst case scenario, it would come down to here. The 100, the 80, and the 50 are purely arbitrary. You, as a board and your leadership team, will want to think about what's normal for us, what's the worst case scenario for us, and what, given the best of our knowledge in the beginning of May, in this thing that nobody knows what to expect from, what right now with the knowledge we have seems to be our most likely scenario. So you're going to do normal, worst case, most likely. Some people have added another situation, which would be normal, best case given this circumstance, and something in the middle and worst case. We have one client that has 6 different scenarios. However many scenarios you have will depend on your organization. 3 is probably manageable, but if you have a situation where you're wondering, we heavily rely on foundations, what would happen if 2 of them fell off, things like that. If special events, let's say you're canceling a special event, so that maybe everything else will come in at 80%, but your special event is going to be 0, then it doesn't have to be 80% of every single situation. So the way that this looks like in a more detailed analysis would be, so we've come up with these revenues, and now you're going to think, if these are our revenues under kind of best case, most likely, and worst case, what do we need to do with our expenses? So you're going to back into your expenses. So you're going to have fixed expenses every month. You have the same amount of rent, same utilities, and then you have an amount remaining, and that amount remaining is basically any expenses that you can control. See, these are expenses that are not in your control. These are expenses that are in your control. Feel free, if you have any questions, I can pause for questions, because I know I'm going over things fairly quickly. Liz will jump in and interrupt me too if she sees any questions pop up. Now, something that some of our clients have been able to do is they've been able to talk to their landlord, and they've been able to get their rent deferred for a month or 2. That could be possible in your situation. So even though I say these are expenses that you can't do anything about, possibly you could get that deferred. However, your landlord might defer your rent. Maybe they'll forgive your rent, but more often than not, we're seeing that rent is getting deferred. I think some of the utility companies might have certain programs available, but generally not. So these are the things that you're trying to make decisions about. What can we do with salaries? What can we do with supplies? So in this scenario here, you decide if everything stays normal or our best case, this is what the salaries will be, this is what supplies will be. If, you know, in our most likely scenario, we're going to cut salaries by 2,000. We can cut our supplies way down. And then worst case, we'll have to cut salaries more. In this particular scenario, this organization has decided to use their savings. So they have $20,000 on hand. So in scenario 1, they don't need to use their savings. In scenario 2, this middle case, they're going to use 1,900 of their savings. And in scenario 3, they've decided, you know, we really need somebody. We can only cut their salary by $5,000, so we're going to need to use $9,000 of their salary. If this was a monthly scenario, though, where your salaries are $25,000 a month, you can imagine that you really can't afford to use $9,000 a month, depending on your situation. Questions? Okay, good. We'll go on to the next slide. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Reach out to your donors. Don't stop reaching out. Has anybody had a gala that they've had to postpone? I've moved you all over to my other screen, so let me look over there. So thumbs up if you had to postpone a gala or a special event. So I do see some postponements. Has anybody thought about moving that online, like some kind of virtual type of event? I think it was 2 weekends ago, I actually was able to go to 2 special events in one day because they were both virtual. And they were actually 2 organizations I had been interested in. May is normally not a good month for me work-wise. I would have never been able to attend these special events, but they were both virtual. They were, one was all of a half an hour because of the way it was structured. Granted, neither organization was going to be able to raise as much as they normally would have for their normal special event, but the time commitment and the money commitment was not anywhere near what they normally would have been engaged in. And I do want to reach out to both of them because I'm curious if the net was similar. So you think, you know, you think you have a gala, you pay a venue, that you pay for the food, you end up with a net. In this case, they had a virtual event, and I'm wondering if when all is said and done, the net, how far the net off was when they originally planned. So, you know, in my very small one-person anecdotal example, we had this situation where, in the case of these 2 organizations, they were able to engage somebody, myself, who was interested. I don't think either of these organizations knew I was interested in them. And I was able to participate in something that I normally would not have been able to participate in. So, you know, think about those virtual events. Possibly 3 months from now, people will be tired of virtual events, but I don't see a lot of that happening right now. So it's probably something worth looking into. Reach out to your donors. I had heard a podcast recently, and they were encouraging, this man shared a story where he was reaching out to his major donors and calling, and he's saying, look, I understand that depending on different people's situations, they might not be able to support us right now. I'm not calling to ask you for money. I'm calling to let you know what we're doing to help the people that we serve. Plus, I want to know, is there anything that I can do for you? Any way I can help you out? And the donor said to him, well, as a matter of fact, I've recently lost my job. And so this executive director of the nonprofit organization said, I don't really have any contacts in your industry, but go on my LinkedIn page. And if you see anyone on my LinkedIn page who you want an introduction to, I would be glad to introduce them to you. And it really meant a lot to the donors. So Liz and I could probably spend the next hour telling you story after story wherein just 6 relatively short weeks, we have seen a richness of relationship develop in so many different circumstances. So I would imagine that some of you will have similar stories about deepening relationships either with your people, the people that you serve, or even deepening relationships with your donors. So don't worry about, don't feel like you have to stop donating at this. Don't feel like you have to stop with your donors right now. So I would encourage you to keep going with that. And then we can go on to the next slide.
So here, I want to really focus in on the kind of well-being of your executive director. So as board members, we talked in the beginning about a responsibility of supporting the executive director as one of your top 10 or one of your 10 basic responsibilities as board members. And remember that even though he or she is struggling to keep an organization running, they're also struggling with everything else that all of us are struggling with. Family commitments, we might have children at home, we might have elderly parents at home, we might have loved ones and friends that we're worried about. And so we found ourselves in this situation, in this crisis, so focused on that initial pivot, if you will, that we want to make sure that we take the time as board members to pause and make sure that our executive director or CEO is also taking the time to pause and check in with her, see how she's doing, see if there's anything that you can do to support her outside of the work of the organization. There was an article recently by Joan Gary. I don't know if any of you follow her or not. And the headline was very catchy. It's what every executive director needs right now. And it went on to talk about what she needs is a phone call, is a check-in. There were a number of stories in that article of executive directors sharing that their board hadn't checked in with them at all, that they felt like, okay, well, the organization has pivoted and things are still continuing to move. We've been able to adapt and serve our clients and our mission in different ways, and therefore everything must be fine. And I won't embarrass one of our attendees, but he is on the call and wrote an article that we have posted in our e-news about really what happens in transitions, and that a crisis is a transition situation. And once we kind of get into and we all settle into this now normal, if you will, it's usually within that 30 to 60 day period that the cracks, as he referenced, start to appear in the organization and in the people in the organization. So for the executive directors who are on the call, make sure you're checking in with the mental health and the emotional health of your staff. And board members, again, make sure you're checking in with the mental and emotional health of your executive director and your leadership team. So the next thing that once within about a week or so, about a week and a half, as we started checking in with and hearing from different organizations, a lot of the conversations we were having and what we were hearing is that initial crisis was beginning to ebb, and that they were moving very quickly into recovery mode. This is when organizations were very quickly learning Zoom, figuring out other options and other ways of serving clients, whether it be telehealth or other virtual options. And so organizations really began to move into the recovery phase. And where we find a lot of us right now are in that recovery. Until we have a good sense of what's going to be happening, we're going to be sitting here and recovering for a period of time. But moving forward, we're going to begin to really think about change. And going back to those basic responsibilities of board members, we talked about effective planning for the organization and strategic planning. And so another great article that we have that we can make available to you is really thinking about where we are. A lot of times what we heard, at least initially, is organizations were thinking of the current situation as a snowstorm or a blizzard. It was going to have us hunkered down for a couple days, but eventually things would move quickly and all of our systems would begin moving again. And we know that's not what happened. Things froze, literally, and have stayed shelter in place. A lot of our businesses have closed and have paused. And if you weren't essential or could work remotely, a lot of us found ourselves really working at home or staying at home. So the lesson is that we should really be thinking about what's happening right now as not a blizzard that will be over in just a few days, and not even the winter, which will be over in a couple of months, but really as an ice age. That's something that's going to be with us for probably years to come. And so when we think about planning for the organization, really beginning to think about what does that mean for the long term in the organization? What does strategic planning look like for us moving forward? Oftentimes when we do strategic planning and we talk about it, we want to talk about it as being a living plan and what happens when there are outside influences that occur. How do we address those in our planning? And that's really exactly where we are right now. So as a board, now that things have begun to level off, hopefully in your organization, and you're in that recovery phase, we can really begin to think about some of the long-term implications of this for our organization and what it means. So now is the time to really begin to plan for the future of the organization. This is where we begin to think about our mission and how we're serving our mission, what it looks like, what social impact that we're having. Some of us might find in organizations that the organization is just simply too big for us to continue. We've taken too much of a financial or programmatic hit with loss of students or members or revenue, and that we need to maybe downsize our organization. So we want to take the time as a board to really work through with our leadership team what the future of the organization is going to look like. And we want to be thinking in terms of strategic thinking. So again, this is a time to revisit the mission, vision, make sure you spell it correctly, and the values of the organization, understanding and asking again, what is our social impact? What are programmatic and operational priorities that we have for the organization? Again, what's working right now? What's not working? What are we going to keep? What are we not going to keep? One of the benefits of this pandemic is that it really opened up and fast-tracked telehealth for a lot of organizations. I have the privilege of working with a funder in granting small COVID emergency grants for organizations, and we've had a lot of requests for technology so that both staff and participants could ramp up quickly to telehealth and other virtual solutions. And for some organizations, these are things that the organization is going to hold on to. Being able to provide counseling and support groups at odd times when it wouldn't be practical necessarily to leave the house. I had an executive director of a domestic violence organization talk about having a client who was able to have a counseling session during a trip to the grocery store because she was able to do it via the phone. And then I have another organization that's providing support groups at 10 p.m. at night. This is something that they had not done before, but they're finding that there are a number of participants who are finding that a valuable time. So moving forward, these are things that both of these organizations are going to keep in place for the future. One thing that another conversation I had with the Nonprofit Repositioning Fund is about collaborations. And for organizations who are finding that they do need to perhaps downsize or streamline their operations, looking for partners so that they can continue to provide those services for their clients by forming partnerships with other organizations. This may be the time that you need to think about a merger with another organization, and you really want to, as a board, take the time to think about this now, going back to the financials and some of those different scenarios. We want to make sure that we have enough runway, if you will, if we do have a merger in our future, that we can plan for it and not run all of the assets of the organization into the ground before we absolutely have to consider a merger. So we want to make sure that we're having some of those difficult conversations right now, and that we're doing some of that scenario planning now, should 6 months from now that be the path that we need to take for our organization. So we want to make sure that we do that. The other thing that we want to take time to do right now is really begin to think about and document what are the lessons that we're learning. Again, I talked a little bit about what's working, what's not working for the organization, but we want to make sure that we're capturing that. Many of us have found that because we are working from home, a benefit is that we've had the ability to attend more professional development trainings. We've been listening in on more webinars, attending programs like this. And so it does allow us to broaden and learn lessons and think about what our colleagues are doing in other organizations. We've allowed the last 30 minutes or so of this presentation for us to have a more of an open forum so that you can ask questions and you can learn from one another in this. So we want to make sure, again, that we take the time to do this. So the last thing that I want to focus on real quick, again, are some of the governance tools that we should be using. This will bring us back to the beginning of where we started with best practices and good governance. We want to make sure that we have and that we're utilizing a board profile. And these are all tools that we can share with you if you need examples of them, if you're not currently using them. But a board profile allows you to really look at your board, the makeup of your board, and to begin to really map it out in terms of skill sets that board members have and different experiences that they bring. This is where we want to look at the diversity of our board. And when we talk about diversity, we talk about a number of different things. We certainly talk about cultural diversity, gender diversity, skills diversity, age diversity, and experience on other organizations. So all of those things we want to be capturing. We want to be thinking about and utilizing a board calendar. So we don't want to have our 990 filing, for example, get lost in this pandemic crisis. For those of us who have 12/31 year ends, we want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on our calendar and that we're aware of grant deadlines that are coming up, event planning deadlines, and all of that, so that we're using a calendar. This is also the time that we should still be thinking about board recruitment. For those of us who have June 30th year ends, we're in prime recruitment time right now, and we shouldn't pause that. Going back to that board profile, thinking about the lessons that we've learned, what skill sets are we missing on our board that we could really have utilized right now? And thinking about engaging some of those individuals in our recruitment process. Certainly making sure that we're using a board candidate application. Even though board service is a volunteer task, should be treated like a job. We want to make sure that people understand what the expectations are getting into it. And we want to make sure that we capture on that application, if you will, all of the things that our potential board members are interested in and all of the past experiences that they have. Again, expectations I've already referenced. We want to have a solid board orientation. And this year it's going to be more important than ever, because we are going to want to share with new board members kind of where we were pre-pandemic, where we are right in the midst of the pandemic, and where we see ourselves moving forward in the future. So that strategic planning and strategic thinking is going to be really critical for our board orientations this year. And then, of course, board evaluation. Board members should be self-evaluating. We should have some sort of a mechanism at least every 3 years for board members to evaluate themselves and their place on the board in this organization. And again, right now, as we're in the midst of this, many of our board members might find themselves in the difficult position of balancing not just their family and their board service, but balancing how their work plays into this current crisis as well. So we need to really take the time to think about, as board members, how we're going to balance all of this, and hopefully finding ways to continue service on the board. But the reality is that for some board members, it's not a good time to stay, and you want to make sure that you're freeing up those spots, because per our bylaws, we only have so many places on our board, and we want to make sure that we are allowing for the organization to really onboard individuals who are able to be engaged. And I just always like to say that for some board members who find that they don't have the time for full board service, moving on to a committee is a great way to stay engaged with the organization. And then the reverse of that is true. As you're doing recruitment, you might want to begin to build your board recruitment pipeline by putting people on a committee first and then moving them into board service. So at this point, we are about 20 after 5. So we're about 40 minutes or so in, and I'd like to open up the floor to questions. I'm going to unmute everybody. So if you're in a situation where you have a lot of background noise, you can go ahead and remute yourself. And unmute all, there we go. And so you should all be unmuted right now, but if you could still use the chat box, and we will begin to entertain questions from the group. Not one question?
No, coming.
Okay. The PPP loans with the SBA. We can certainly talk quite a bit more in depth on that. Cindy's done quite a bit of work with that, and we've done some other webinars around that topic. Do you have specific questions about them? I don't want to occupy too much of this time with that, but we can certainly talk more offline, unless you have kind of a quick.
Is it okay if I speak it rather than type it?
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess just surrounding our organization did apply for it and did receive the funds, but want to just make sure in terms of the quote necessity for it. In our organization, our board very generously makes their donations in the front half of the year, knowing that we're a very small organization, but knowing that a lot of our fundraising, we have a golf outing in the fall. We're hoping to do another prospective new donor event in the fall as well. So it's those funds that we're not secure about. We don't know for sure. So for us, we thought that would qualify as being necessary, because if you start doing the scenarios, the cash flow scenarios like you described, we very quickly could say that we don't have much certainty around what's going to happen in the fall. So I guess, yeah, that's the question is there any more guidance about how you define necessity? And I'm assuming that doesn't mean cash in the bank in April or now May, but where you project you're going.
I'm trying to pull up the exact phrasing of that question because it's really unfortunate. You're one of a number of clients and nonprofits that I was very concerned about that. As you heard from the news, the reason that they added that language to the guidance was because of people like the LA Lakers or these big organizations getting it, or Harvard University, and like, wait a minute. And we have some clients that nonprofits and churches that have endowment funds, and so they would think, oh, should I be using my endowment fund? But one of the things that we talked to them about was, how many years did it take you to put that endowment fund together? If it took you 20 years to raise that money for the endowment fund, and in 4 months you're going to cut it in half, that gives you a leg to stand on. Let me see if I can quickly find the phrasing, because there's a lot in the news that's bantered about this question, but I really encourage you to look specifically at this question 31, which as a board, you probably have looked at it. The phrasing. Okay, so the text is current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant, and it would be difficult to access other avenues of liquidity without having a detrimental effect on the organization. So there's two parts there. So one of the things we were saying, it's economic uncertainty makes it necessary to support ongoing operations. So what we want to think about is economic uncertainty, not just right now when you have all your board member donations, but just like you mentioned, economic uncertainty for the coming months.
Okay.
The second part was access to capital, and so without a detrimental effect to the organization. So maybe you have a $100,000 line of credit, but would it be detrimental to the organization to draw down on the whole $100,000? Some nonprofits have, a lovely building that was donated to them 50 years ago, but if you don't have any cash flow, should you really be taking a mortgage out on this building when it will become detrimental to the organization to pay back that mortgage? So those are the two parts. So you are, sitting nodding your head, or other people are like, yeah, that's us, that's us. So what you need to do though, is you need to document this situation. So document, these are the things that are uncertain about. Right now, we have no idea when Pennsylvania is going to get to yellow, let alone green. So we have no idea if we can have our fall fundraiser, because we don't know when we can ever put up, when we can put 100 people in a room again. So that is economic uncertainty, and our fall fundraiser raises X amount of dollars. We don't know, if the donors for the next half of the year, what type of donations we can expect to get in. And so really think about it kind of over a 2-year period. So, maybe the answer is yes, we could use savings to get us through 2 months, but if we use those savings, we're not going to have any cushion. So you're going to document things like that. It's so good that all of you here are board members, because what I hear time and time again is document this in the minutes of your board meetings that you've had this conversation. So like we're telling our nonprofit executive directors, make sure this is in your minutes. Go back to the board meeting where, or that emergency phone call you had with the board, where it was approved that you would apply for the loan, and document, and yes, you don't, even if you didn't take the minutes at the time and include this in your minutes, you can certainly go back and document it and say, these are the things that we talked about on that emergency phone call when we were trying to decide, should we apply for this? These are the things we were concerned about. So part of it is going to be subjective information. These are the things we're concerned about. And then you're going to match that subject information with objective information. This is how much we normally earn with our fall fundraiser. These are the funds that we would normally get, between March of 2020 and December of 2021. Because, a lot of pundits are saying it can take, recovery could happen as early as 6 months, or it could be as late as 2 years. So if you think, I would project out what you think your cash flow would be for 2 years and say, this is why we believe this is necessary, because somewhere in month 12, month 18, month 24, it's going to get difficult for us. So, so that's going to be your objective data.
Okay, so we go ahead and do that now so that in case we get audited down the road and we can't quite remember, that it's all there. And yeah, okay, thank you. Very helpful.
And they are going to audit organizations that received more than $2 million in PPP funds. So if that's your case,
No.
document that as well, because you would be audited. But we do have a client in Health and Human Services, and they did receive more than $2 million, but they definitely needed it. They had to shut down, things that are bringing in quite a bit of money every single day. I don't know any of our clients or any of our friends in the nonprofit world who did not need this in any way, shape, or form, regardless of the types of endowments that they had. If you do have an endowment, document how long it took you to build up that endowment, and how you use the earnings on that endowment. If it's a donor restricted endowment, you can't use it, so you don't have to worry about the donor restricted endowment. If it's a board endowment where the board said we're going to, as a board, we're going to take $100,000 out of our savings and put that away, then you would document, it took this many years to save up a surplus of $100,000 so that we could decide to put that away. Does anybody else have any other revenue sources that they're concerned would fall into this provision?
Yeah, our organization has a big fall fundraiser that's a gala.
Okay.
So it's one of probably our major fundraiser of the year.
Okay.
So there's no question that this would, I'm just grateful to hear about, thinking this through in advance, because we're sort of one step behind that. So this is really enormously helpful.
Oh, good.
Mhm.
And if things turn out lovely and you can have the gala, that will not mean that you were wrong in applying for the loan. What you're talking about is what you knew at the time you applied for the loan. So if there's optimism, a month from now, it's like there's a vaccine or something, it doesn't matter. All that matters is right now you're concerned. Oh, Lois, go ahead.
Just one more follow-up question. I'm just not that familiar with the source of these loans. What is it, and what is the timeline, and how do we learn about this?
Oh, okay. So the source of loans is SBA, and we can send you some information offline.
Okay.
In fact, we can send it, information to everybody. There was one round of funding. There's a second round of funding. I would say it is most applicable to organizations if you have employees. So I know some of you online are more volunteer. Some of you do have employees. If you have employees and you are still able to provide services, this is probably something you should consider.
Mm-hmm. That's us. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Good.
Lois, we can send you some more information, and on our website, catalystnonprofit.com, we have a number of links to the SBA and to some fast facts about the PPP loan and the EIDL loan. So, but we can post that and get that out to anybody else who's interested as well. And then to your other question regarding your executive director who just resigned, it's kind of interesting. I just this week launched an executive search for an organization. They were in the plans for this position prior to COVID, and we're moving forward. We're moving forward with it as a contract position, hopefully to become full-time permanent, depending on what happens. But the answer kind of to your question is it really kind of depends. If you feel that you have a really strong strategic plan in place and that you foresee that your organization is going to be business as usual moving forward, you might want to bring in a new executive director right now with the thought that they will work through your current strategic plan. The other side of that is you might find that there's quite a bit of uncertainty and that you might really benefit from having a new leadership that can think strategically moving forward and can help you think about the organization in new ways. So both of those are kind of cases for moving forward with your search right now. If you're really not sure, but you need someone in that leadership position, You might consider contracting with an interim executive director, someone who can take over those day-to-day tasks for the next 2 months or so until you can see clear, and that way you can get the support you need, but then you can also think about and have a little bit more clarity moving forward for that search.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Next question we have Bernie talking about your economically diverse board. So when we talk about give and get, a lot of times those documents, maybe that annual expectation, annual affirmation, or annual board contract, if you write it all out and have board members sign it, it might have language in there that says that board members are expected to make a financial contribution. Usually we add give or get in there, and it is always prudent to have at a level that is personal and meaningful to you, so that individuals can decide, I might be able to make a larger gift, but my colleague might only be able to make a smaller gift. So the answer to that is that everybody should be making a gift, a personal monetary gift to the organization, not an in-kind gift, but a personal monetary gift. But that amount can vary greatly. So as you're having conversations with donors and funders, you want to be able to honestly and truthfully say that we have 100% giving on the board. And if that means that somebody gives $10 and somebody gives $10,000 so that you can have a diverse board, then, and diverse in terms of economic background, then absolutely those levels aren't quite as important.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And yes, the governance tools that I showed on the last slide, some of them we have as links on our Catalyst nonprofit website, but I can certainly put up the ones that aren't on our website. I can pop them up there so that you can download them as Word documents and then use them as templates.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Lois, I see you.
How long do you think it will take to put this recording up? Because I'm thinking now that I'm sitting through this, that I would really like a few more people to see this sooner than later.
I should be able to, once we're done the session, I'll save it, and then I need to move it over to YouTube and upload it. So by tomorrow, it should be up.
Tomorrow. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Do we have other questions? I'm scrolling through everybody's pictures.
Hollywood Squares.
Right. I need to figure out how to get it all the way around. Well, I do want to thank all of you for taking the time this evening.
Thanks to you.
Thank you.
To be here, and hopefully you found it beneficial. You have both of our emails, so we're happy to connect with you offline and answer any questions and share resources that we have with you. And keep your eye out on our website for future training programs. So good. Thank you all so very much. Stay well, stay healthy, stay safe, and hopefully we'll meet in person in the not too distant future.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.